In this video, we're getting everything finalized because I'm sure you're as ready as I am to see this beautiful designer table come to life. And whether or not you agree with the color choices on this piece, one thing we can probably all agree on is, what in the heck was I thinking? In last video, we finished up the modern leg assembly. And the two pieces of C-channel that connect the legs to the tabletop need to have a groove routed so that they're inset. This is pretty easily done just by marking out where they go and using a straight edge with a router to route out the channels. This is somewhat of a bravery test considering we've already put a lot of hours into the tabletop, and the last thing we want to do is screw up now. So now a quick blow with the hammer will mark where the lag screw is sticking up. Then we can just use a Forstner bit to drill out that material. Woodcraft by Satin actually did a great video about using threaded inserts versus tapping the wood itself, and it turns out you might not even need to use threaded inserts, but at the time of this filming, I didn't have a wood tap and I did have inserts, so I'm choosing to use those. In a previous video, we got the brass plating cut and it wasn't a fun process. But now we're all healed up so we can make templates to fit the brass to the leg assembly. It's just a lot easier to cut the paper rather than the brass to make sure everything fits perfect. So after cleaning up the edges of the brass, we can obviously use that template to mark where to cut. And I know this is probably hair-raising to see me freehanding this on the table saw, but it was a lot slower of a cut than you would think, and it was actually pretty safe for me. Honestly, a much safer way to do this would have just been making a sled for this little table saw, but I didn't, and this is what I chose. Either way, the brass is fitting like a glove, and I'm creating a small micro bevel with the sander so that I don't leave sharp exposed edges. This is actually a pretty enjoyable process. One thing I would suggest though is wearing some sort of gloves, because wherever that clear masking isn't on the brass, you can cause tarnishing with your fingerprints, and that'll just cause extra work later to sand off. I did mention in the previous video that this is a Hellman & Chang design, which is actually a $30,000 table, and that's why I titled that video as I did. In all honesty though, I didn't even price this table for a third of that. I priced it for $8,500, which realistically, I kinda screwed myself over. I highly underestimated how much work and material cost would go into this table. I guess all I can say is running a business is always a learning process. The first epoxy that I used with the brass did not adhere very well, but after a new test, JB Weld 5-minute epoxy has great adhesion, and luckily just rerouting the rabbet actually cuts the old epoxy off perfectly. I'm just adding file marks for the best adhesion possible, and we can start round 2 of the inlay work. And this time around, I'm feeling a lot more confident that the brass isn't just gonna fall off. And let's be honest, I probably lost a few nights of sleep over that one, but I guess everything's just another learning opportunity. While I'm sanding this end flush, I'm going to make sure that I'm keeping it square because any skewing could result in the breadboard being kinked. I'm also doing something that's more important than you'd probably think. I'm sanding a round over on just the ends of the inlay bands. This has a fairly simple reason. If and when the table contracts, we don't want that sharp edge of the brass exposed, ready to cut someone's hand. Conversely, we also want to round over the table edge in case it expands past the breadboard. The next step is to drill holes through the bottom side of each breadboard. This will house pegs that hold everything to the table. A quick auxiliary block just decreases tear out. Now we can hammer them on and mark the holes using that same bit. You can see that it marks the center perfectly, but we don't want to just drill exactly where that is, otherwise the pegs won't draw the breadboard tight. So I'm actually putting pressure towards the shoulder side of the tenon, that way it offsets the hole by about 1 millimeter. And to make things even a little bit more complicated, we can't just leave this a single hole, it actually has to be a slot so that the table can expand and contract. So by drilling 3 holes side by side, I can just file that into a groove. The most important part is that through the action of filing, I don't want to file it too loose because then the peg won't draw it tight. So I'm constantly checking with digital calipers to make sure I'm not screwing that part up. We do want to peg it in the center so it just gets a hole. The pegs themselves are going to be made with ebony since I have some left over from previous guitar builds, and it's extremely strong so it'll resist any loosening over time, since the grooves in the tenons could start wearing away at any softer pegs. A small taper on one end will just ease the process of driving them in when the time comes. So now I can get rid of that sharp edge on the table as well as any sharp edges on the brass. Pre-coloring any expansion ends now will just make sure they're black. The sequence of this glue up is actually rather important. I want to make sure that the pegs get glued in their holes, but I don't want the whole breadboard to be glued to the table. Only the center of the tenon will get glued since there will only be minimal expansion there. The rest has to be open for wood movement, otherwise it compromises this entire process. Now we don't want to just hammer the pegs in willy-nilly because we could blow them out the other side. So instead I seat them about 2/3 of the way, then use a long reach C-clamp to do the rest. These pegs will be a little bit tight to go in because of that offset hole. And we really need them all the way in for full strength, so if you can't get them, then I'll show you a method here in a second. I like to clean up the glue squeeze out before I flush cut, that way my saw doesn't get all gunked up. Thankfully, that side went perfect and we can start the other side. I learned quickly that I could just give the clamp a quick smack with the hammer to seat the peg. So the clamp keeps the peg from blowing out the other side, but the hammer adds that extra force needed. And there they are, just exposed on the bottom side. It's starting to look like an upside down table. But not for long because we need to get this thing ready for finish. We're doing a final sanding to 150 and the ends of the breadboards can finally be cut off. The final table length is 10 feet long, and every edge needs to be sanded to perfection, while Cody breaks any sharp edges on the leg base. One end needs one more quick flattening to be in plane with the table. Not much though, because most of that work was already done. The orbit sander leaves random scratch marks in the brass, and I personally don't think this looks good under a finish. So silly me, I'm actually straight sanding the brass now, but we're gonna have to just end up doing it later anyways, so it's pointless. The top edge of the table gets a micro bevel to make it easier on the user's arms. And yes, we can just route right over the brass. This next step is a fairly important one if you've seen some of my other table videos. I start by spraying all the dust out of the grain, then saturate the whole table with water. This process keeps the grain from raising later if any water were to infiltrate the finish. And we are going to be staining this, so get ready. After it's dry, I'm having Cody do the final sanding to 220. And while he cleans all the dust out of the grain, I'm mixing up some dark filler. I want the filler mixture to be pretty dark because the final stain color is going to be black. And this first round should be about the consistency of drywall mud. Just make sure your knife doesn't have burrs on it so that you don't create cross-grain scratches. I tend to go across the grain for the first coat and with the grain for the second, hoping that that fills up the pores as much as possible. A quick sanding to 220 between the two coats helps free up any of that loose filler. The second coat is much thinner because by now the bigger pores have been filled and we need to fill the much smaller micro pores. And while that's drying, Cody can tape off the sides so we can officially stain the bottom. The stain we're using is Varathane's black gel stain, not to be confused with jet black, because jet black would actually cover up all of the grain and there would be no transparency left. And I know right now through the camera it looks like I'm just covering up all that beautiful walnut grain. But I promise after the solvent urethane finish goes on, all of that transparency will actually come back. And we don't want overlap marks on the sides, so that's why it was taped off to begin with. But now the bottom's done and something compels me to get this thing flipped over by myself. Which I don't know why I'm willing to take a risk like this, but I guess I am. So the stupid reason why I decided to flip the table myself is because if I get a neighbor to help me, I'll be talking for the next 45 minutes.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
And she's right, I don't have time for that because I have to get this puppy sanded and stained before the weekend so that it can cure. Because failure to let the stain cure at this point could result in the finish not adhering correctly. So for the second time, I'm straight sanding the brass inlay so that it has a brushed look. And silly enough, I'm actually going to be doing it a third time, because I like to torture myself with repeatable, monotonous steps. To keep the brass from staining black, I'm using this archaic looking tool that I made to cut the purfling on my violin to now cut strips in tape. You can buy 1/4 inch wide tape, but I have this cutter, so I just cut it myself. I intentionally cut it less wide than the inlay, that way I can just use 2 layers to get a perfect fit. Now the sides and the top can get stained black, which seems horrifying because it looks like I'm just destroying the table. But realistically, this black tone will actually fit the customer's house and decor a lot better than the walnut will. And we all know black and white are just in style these days. Nonetheless though, this actually looks pretty freaking cool in the end, so just stick around. The legs and the sides of the table are going to have a satin finish urethane on them, while the top face of the table will have a high gloss urethane finish. But stick around till the end because this will actually present a problem for the breadboard joint. On the bottom side of the table, the fortress emblem can be inlaid. I use part epoxy for strength and part CA glue for speed. And I like the matte black sheen on the emblem, and I don't want the urethane to change that sheen, so I'm going to cover it with tape. Now we can begin a rather complex and advanced finishing process. I would love to just be able to tell you that this is easy and DIY and anyone can do it, but we're dealing with different sheens and a lot of different processes during this entire finishing stage. The bottom of this table is the easiest part though, it just gets 2 coats of sealer. This Imron sealer happens to dry in a satin sheen, so I can just leave it as is. And you can see some of that clarity coming back into the wood. While that's flashing off, I'm prepping the brass by cleaning it with acetone, and I shortly realized that we left fingerprints, so I have to sand those back off. Then I can clean them again and spray them with sealer. The point of the sealer is to make sure that the brass doesn't tarnish in the future. And I'm doing 1 coat of sealer and 1 coat of top coat with a sanding in between, but you really only need just 1 coat to seal brass off. The brass screws that will hold the plating on also need to be sanded and top coated. Then the plating can get its final satin top coat. This is the same Imron satin that I'll use for the sides of the table and the leg assembly. Now we can responsibly flip the whole table with 2 people instead of 1. And I'm sure you're going to find this hard to believe, but it's a lot easier with 2 people. We can begin spraying the sides and the top with sealer. The top is going to get 6 coats of sealer today, and the sides are going to get 3. The legs will get 2 coats of sealer, then left to cure. We don't want a bunch of thick sealer to be in areas where we didn't fill the grain because it'll actually make the pores look a little weird. And when that sealer is dry, we actually test some blue tape on it because, yep, I feel like we need to sand this brass one more time. With 1 coat of sealer on the table, I could tell that the brass just wasn't perfect, so I sanded through the sealer and sanded the brass to perfection this time, followed by 5 more coats of sealer. After giving the finish 2 days to cure and shrink up, I can begin sanding. 320 grit will help get rid of any high spots, texture, or dust nibs that may be in the film at this point. The next seal coats won't adhere either if we don't add scratches to the finish. Because there is such a high risk of sanding through into the black stain, I'm actually just taking it about this far and not getting rid of all the texture. 1 more coat on the sides and 4 more subsequent coats on the top will add more build so that I can flatten it better later. And with 10 coats of sealer on and flashed off, we can get this into the other room because the other room stays much hotter and we can offer more airflow there. This will sit for about 1 week to shrink up. Meanwhile, we can get the legs sanded and vacuumed off. We want to make sure we don't leave any white specks in any of the pores, otherwise these could show up later. 1 last coat of satin top coat will get rid of that hazy look and bring back that beautiful color. And 1 week later, we can bring this 250-pound tabletop back out.
Oh my God! Ouchie!
The first step to do is flatten and sand the sides for that same satin top coat. Any overspray on the top will actually be taken care of in the next step. which I made this big sanding block with 320 grit, because this will actually get the table sanded flat, unlike any other small sander that would just conform to the waviness of the table, which you can actually see the low spots even despite me meticulously flattening this table earlier. Wood is just a natural thing with variations in grain hardness, and it's hard to get perfectly flat. I make sure to periodically clean off any specks of finish on the sandpaper. This is called corning. And that corning can potentially make really deep scratch marks in your table that you won't know are there until you get the top coat on. And now that everything is flat as glass, I can do a final sanding with the orbital and touch up any edges with a sanding pad. These 320 scratches are actually too coarse to just jump right to gloss top coat, because the top coat doesn't have enough build to fill in the scratches as well as give me enough thickness to buff. Then one last coat of sealer fills in those scratches, and 2 coats of gloss top coat can be sprayed in that same day to make sure that it burns in. So by now the gloss is almost perfect, but it has just a little bit of texture. And like I said before, this really is an advanced process because now we begin 2 more days of sanding and buffing. I used 400 grit to lightly do an initial flattening pass. Then it needs to be cleaned and the bevels can be flared in with 1000 grit. The next grits are going to be wet sanded, and I don't want that slurry to get in the joint between the table and the brass inlay, since we rounded those edges over for expansion. The reason why this process is a bit agonizing is because there's only 2 coats of gloss top coat and we can't burn through that, otherwise we'll actually get what's called ghosting or haloing. This happens when you burn through the top coat into the sealer and you can actually see the different clarity that the sealer has versus the top coat. So after each grit, it's really important to clean off the table and make sure you haven't burned through, because if you have, then it's kind of pointless to continue. And you also need to clean the table to make sure that the previous grit doesn't contaminate the next grit. After 5000, I can begin using cutting compound to start buffing the table. We want to make sure we get rid of all of these pigtails. So I actually end up switching from an orbital to a direct drive buffer. This creates a little bit more heat and friction so that it gets rid of the scratches easier. I'm just making sure I don't burn through. And now I've switched to a blue pad and I'm using polish, which will make this thing look like a freaking Ferrari. And you can see I'm extremely happy because I didn't burn through. And thankfully that finalizes that finish. When a project gets to this point, I can't help but feel just pure gratitude. There's just something bittersweet about finding myself in stressful situations and overcoming obstacles in a project. Because although the added stress no doubt adds some gray hairs here and there, crossing that line from problem to solution is what builds experience and character. The process of learning isn't always easy, and it shouldn't be. Because if I'm playing it safe, then I'm probably not growing. And if I'm not growing, then I'm usually not happy. So I guess what I'm getting at is stress equals happiness in its own far-fetched way. So since that happiness can be a rather hard thing to obtain, it's important to sit in it and have gratitude when it is there. That is until future Corey comes bearing bad news. Unfortunately, I have some bad news. It's been about 3 months since we delivered the table, and it's now winter time. The clients have messaged me and the finish is being pulled right off of the brass inlay because of the contracting table. And I know that there's no way that I could just do a quick fix. So there will be an update video on this table later on, but until then, it's time for final shots. Please subscribe by clicking the left icon, check out all of our awesome build videos, and here's another unique video to watch.